All right, guys, thanks so much for coming back in after your coffee break. I really appreciate it. So next I've got the pleasure of introducing Dr. Simon Ruffell. So Dr. Ruffell is trained across 3 modalities. He's a psychiatrist and a researcher, bridging Western medicine, psychology, and traditional Amazonian plant medicine. He founded Onaya Science, to study ayahuasca in a natural setting and serves as a lecturer in psychology and psychedelics at the University of Exeter. And he is the Chief Medical Officer of MINDS, which is the Multidisciplinary Investigation into Novel Discoveries and Solutions. Today, Dr. Ruffell will speak on the ideas of integrating Indigenous knowledge and Western science in psychedelic research. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruffell.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. Okay, so today we're going to be thinking about a little bit about my background. I'm going to tell you how I got into doing research in the Amazon rainforest. And then we're going to talk about how we can navigate between different knowledge systems, between the Western scientific way of thinking about the world and also indigenous ways of thinking about the world as well. And I'm going to describe an example of the indigenous cosmologies using the Shipibo, who I've been working with for the last 10 years. And then we're going to talk about the research that I've been doing in the Amazon rainforest, thinking about how we can change the way that we approach this research to really bridge the gap between these 2 paradigms. I'm going to think about decolonizing methodologies and why it's important that we engage with that, and then finish with a vision for the future of the way that I'd like to see psychedelic research shaping up. Okay, so I started off my career as a medical doctor. I trained in medicine. The only reason I went to medical school is because I wanted to do psychiatry. I spent about 6 years learning about all the bones in the foot, which was incredibly boring. And then eventually, when I got through medical school, I started working in psychiatry. And to begin with, I absolutely loved it. I loved everything about it. I loved the patients. I found the theory fascinating. The staff were great. All of it was incredible. But there was just one major problem with it, and that was that a significant proportion of our patients didn't seem to get better. Now, and that was largely due to pharmacological treatments. Now, I'm not against drug treatments. I think that drug treatments can be fantastic, especially antipsychotics, when there's a real issue to do with risk. But unfortunately, there was a significant portion of my patients that were just coming back time and time again in psychiatry after we discharged them. Now, I'm not the only psychiatrist that thinks this. We even have a term for this in psychiatry, and we call it the revolving door syndrome. And this has largely led to psychiatry being considered the Cinderella specialty of medicine. So I thought, right, what am I going to do? So I decided to take a break from Western medicine. I didn't really have much of a plan. I ended up traveling down from North America to South America. And along that way, I ended up sitting in a cafe in Guatemala by chance, or fate, as I've now come to think of it, sitting next to somebody who was training to be a Shipibo curandero, a Shipibo shaman. And he happened to be on holiday from working in Peru, and I also was traveling, and so I ended up speaking to him about ayahuasca. Now, he'd been working with ayahuasca for the last 10 or so years. This was 2015 that I met him, and he was telling me that he'd been using ayahuasca to treat many of the conditions that I've been struggling to treat in my own patients back home. He was describing treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, and a variety of other conditions. And he was using words that we would never use in psychiatry, like cure. But the thing that was really interesting to me was that he was saying that the reason that this worked was because he was communicating with spirits and he was asking spirits to heal on his behalf. And I couldn't believe that he was just speaking out loud about this. I thought that this was, some kind of a joke. Anyway, I decided to go down with him when he invited me to go down with him to Peru. I drank ayahuasca for the first time. I did a retreat. I thought it was amazing, but I definitely wasn't completely convinced by everything that he was saying. So I started looking into the research that had been done into ayahuasca, and much to my surprise, although there was some early stage research looking into the effects of ayahuasca in syncretic churches in Brazil, which are churches that combine Christianity with ayahuasca, there was pretty much nothing that was actually looking at the ceremonial use of ayahuasca in a scientific way. So I was based at King's College London at the time. I started doing research into ayahuasca and personality. And then after I did my first study, I got some funding from the Medical Research Council, which is part of the UK government, and started looking at the effects of ayahuasca on common mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, and also the effects of ayahuasca on epigenetics. And so that's the way in which the environment can change the expression of our genes. I founded the not-for-profit research organization ONAIA. We do our best to bridge the gap between Western science and indigenous knowledge. I ended up doing a PhD into Amazonian ayahuasca and mental health, and then 7 years ago started training as a curandero, started training in shamanism under the Shipibo that I've been working with. And that completely transformed my perception of reality, of health, of illness, of wellness, of everything really. Most recently, we've been looking at groups of military veterans who are coming to the Amazon rainforest, and we're looking at EEG, gut microbiome, epigenetics, PTSD, obviously, quantitative and qualitative measures as well. Okay. So this is where our research retreat center is based in the Peruvian Amazon. It's in a national reserve called the Mashana, right in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. So this is the Mashana community, which is a community of about 100 indigenous individuals. And this is where we do our research. It's called Riosbo, and it's a retreat and research center. And this is Don Rono Lopez, who is the Shipibo curandero who I've been apprenticing under over the last 7 years. And I'm going to speak a little bit about what I've learned from him in this talk and how that's changing the way that I approach research. Okay, so I just want to start off by thinking a little bit about the so-called psychedelic renaissance. I'm saying so-called because it's really only a psychedelic renaissance in the West. Indigenous communities have been using psychedelics for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It never went away. There's no renaissance. This is just us who's saying that it's a renaissance. So psychedelics arguably are going mainstream. Maybe they even have gone mainstream. At all good universities, there is a psychedelic research department. And that's led to massive investments into research, media, and investments into various psychedelic companies as well. And so this is really a moment of great potential for psychedelic research. And there are many people who feel that they've been failed by the Western medical system who are now getting a lot of hope. But despite that, there are massive risks that we're going to repeat the extractive models that Western science has such a terrible track record of engaging in. We're repeatedly going to indigenous cultures, we're taking various things, we're not giving back, and we're leaving them in terrible states. And there's a real risk that we're doing that again with psychedelics. But there are some other risks that I think that people aren't talking about, which are my main area of interest at the moment. So the indigenous communities that I work with have been working with psychedelics for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they have specific ways of working, particularly with ayahuasca, to make sure that you do it safely and to make sure that it's efficacious as possible, that you have the best effect as possible. And Western science is largely completely ignoring everything that they're saying. And these are things like entities, like spirits, like emotional blockages, things that just don't fit into a Western scientific paradigm. And I feel that that's incredibly dangerous, and we need to open up that dialogue. And I'm going to spend the rest of the talk explaining to you why that is. So a quick note on medicalization as well. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm not against the medicalization of psychedelics. And I think that actually medicalization of psychedelics differs from more traditional biomedicalization of standard pharmaceuticals. So for example, we see that there's a reinsertion of psychotherapy into clinical trials. There can be existential and relational dimensions that are emphasized in psychedelic research. And sometimes, as Langlitz points out, we can even insert spirituality into psychiatric practice through psychedelics. However, these just aren't added extras when we look at indigenous communities. And so, for example, Shipibo healing intrinsically uses spirit, community, and land. And if we're not adding these things into our research, if they're not fundamental to our research, we really can't understand these practices. So Western science, I'm not against Western science, obviously a tool. My background is as a scientist. I think it's a fantastic tool that we have. But we should note that Western science is definitely rooted in specific values, as people like Harding point out. It's focused on control, measurement, and prediction. And various people over the years have argued that Western science is actually becoming a dominant belief system rather than a method that we should be using. Scientists are trained to see the world in particular ways and sometimes even ignore phenomena that don't fit into that worldview. So many people are arguing that Western science isn't as objective as we'd like to think that it is, but actually it's a socially organized system with different beliefs and different practices. In Western science, we place objectivity as the highest form of truth. We try to reduce everything down to try and make our results as reliable as possible so that we can say for sure that a various chemical or a various substance has caused an effect. But this is the direct opposite of indigenous knowledge, which is largely subjective. So in indigenous knowledge systems, what they care about is what was the experience for you? How did it feel? What did you see? That's the most important thing. That's the thing that matters. We also need to remember that science is not the only valid way of knowing. There are many other different ways of understanding the universe, of understanding health and illness, and Western science is just one of those ways. So now we're going to move on to thinking about different knowledge systems, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I've learned from training with the Shipibo over the last 7 years. So in Shipibo cosmology, like many different indigenous traditions all around the world, everything is perceived to be alive. Everything is perceived to have a degree of consciousness. Now, this is a concept called animism. And so obviously in Shipibo, because we're working a lot with plants, plants are seen as being sentient, plants are seen as being conscious. But it goes further than that. So stones, rivers, even tables, even agua florida, which is a ceremonial tool which is used in ceremony. It's this mass-produced alcohol water from the 1980s that's made in New York. That's seen as having a very strong spirit in ceremonies as well. Everything has a spirit. Everything has some degree of consciousness. And according to this cosmovision, plants are no longer just substances. So when we're doing research, we're not just investigating a plant as a substance that you take, it's actually a teacher. It's a sentient being that you can learn from within this cosmology. Now, obviously, this sounds very, very different to Western science, but we don't need to be proving this with Western science for it to be valid. This has been practiced and refined for generations. So in itself, it already is a valid knowledge system. Now, healing, according to the Shipibo, is largely to do with restoring right relationship. So when I first started apprenticing under Don Rono, I was quite surprised that he didn't really speak about healing at all. Actually, what he spoke about the whole time was bringing everything back into a state of balance. And he described that on 3 different levels, on 3 different planes. So he explained that you have, first of all, the spiritual level, which is the highest level. And if you're out of balance on that plane, most people from the global north probably would recognize it. Maybe you feel a little bit weird, unless you, had some kind of training in a spiritual tradition. But if you didn't address that, it would begin to manifest on the next level, which is roughly the mental or the psychological level. That's when you begin to develop anxiety, depression, maybe psychosis, various other psychiatric disorders. And if you don't address that and you don't treat that balance, then it will begin to manifest on the next level, which is the physical level. You begin to get physical symptoms. Now, obviously, most of our medicine is only focused on that final stage. And according to the Shipibo, you would try and treat people, keep them in balance before it gets to that level. Now, obviously, this doesn't explain all conditions, but it's an interesting way of thinking about how conditions might manifest. Now, in this cosmology, the tools that we use to restore that alignment are spirits. We communicate with spirits. Those spirits treat on your behalf, on the behalf of the curandero. Songs, the medicinal chanting songs like icaros, help to bring balance back there as well. And obviously plants too. Now, the curanderos, the shamans, are the first to say that they're not actually the ones who are treating their participants. Actually, what they are, the role of a shaman is a middleman. You're a middleman between the patient and the spirit world. And so you're asking spirits to heal on your behalf. And the role of the shaman is to form relationships with those spirits. And we'll go into how you do that in just a little bit. Now, like many different indigenous traditions, the Shipibo is a language of patterns. So we can see here this beautiful diagram, this beautiful artwork is something called kuna. And these geometric shapes aren't just decorative motifs. They're actually a visual language of health and disorder. And in the Shipibo, in the use of kuna, everything has its own unique energetic fingerprint, its own unique kuna. So I would have my own unique kuna, and the shamans would describe being able to see that kuna when they drink ayahuasca in ceremonies. And that pattern would be a really detailed spiritual fingerprint that describes everything about who I am as a person, my strengths, my weaknesses, where I'm at in my life, my connections, everything about me. But it goes one step further. And you can also have, or there are also kunas that form between two different people. So for example, my relationship with Orla, our friendship, who we are as colleagues, everything about us will be represented in a kuna that describes who we are as two different people. And then everyone here at this conference, we would have our unique kuna of who we are, of people who are interested in psychedelics, where we are in this movement, who we are as a group, and our views. And then it goes out and out and out to the whole universe as well. And so you use these medicinal chants, the icaros, which are sung at night in the ceremonies, to restore any distortions in that kuna, because illness would show up as some kind of a blur within your kuna pattern. Now, interestingly, each icaro, each of the medicinal healing songs the Shipibo use, also have their own unique kuna associated with it as well. So it literally describes everything in the whole universe. And of course, other indigenous traditions, like the indigenous Australians, have different patterns that also perform a similar function. So one of the cornerstones of training in Shipibo curanderismo is the master plant and dieta. And so this is when you form a relationship with the spirit of a plant. And what you do is you go into isolation for prolonged periods. So it's usually in something called a tambo, which is a small hut in the Amazon rainforest. You spend weeks, months. Some of the old school Shipibos would spend years there. And you starve yourself of everything, of food, or even of water, which is really hard in the Amazon, all social contact, and you just consume a small amount of a specific plant that the Shipibo perceive to be enlightened or some kind of teacher plant, and you connect with the spirit of that plant. And then through your dreams, through intuition, through your ceremonies, that plant begins to teach you. And you then ask that plant to heal on your behalf when you're in ceremony. And so in this way, you're not taking a plant, you're actually engaging in a relationship with it. It becomes a teacher and you're learning from it. And that plant teaches through your silence, through your presence and your devotion. And so this really challenges us as scientists when we're studying things like ayahuasca to think about how we think about plants in research and in medicine. Because this is a completely different paradigm that we just don't understand, that we can't fit into a Western scientific research. Okay, so according to the Shipibo, illness is a form of disconnection. Now, that disconnection can be to yourself, to spirit, to ancestors, to land, and it can stem from a variety of different things. It might be trauma, it might be conflict, it might be ancestry. And in the research that we've been doing in the Amazon rainforest with the military veterans with PTSD, that's definitely been reflected in our cohorts. These veterans feel disconnected from themselves. They feel disconnected from their communities. They feel disconnected from maybe the United States of America if they feel that they've been lied to when they've been taken into the army. And in this sense, the trauma and the disconnection isn't just a symptom, it's actually a broken relationship that needs to be restored. So obviously, this is a completely different epistemology. This is a completely different paradigm to the one that we're used to in Western science. And in this way, knowledge isn't just numerical, it's not just data, it's actually a relationship. It's embodied, it's felt, and it's intuitive. So I hope that you can see now why I don't feel that we can just take the chemicals from ayahuasca and look at it in a lab and say that we're researching ayahuasca. No, if we do that, we're just looking at DMT, harmala, alkaloids, concoctions. That's not ayahuasca, that's something different. Without these relationships, it doesn't work in the same way, and we can't fully understand it. So what does this ask of us as scientists, as researchers, when we're engaging with other people's medicines and in different paradigms? Well, I think the question here is really not whether we should be abandoning Western science, not at all, but whether we can widen it, whether we can hold different truths at once. And I would argue that this is actually a different kind of rigor to be able to respect multiple ways of knowing at once. Now, I'm certainly not saying that we all need to adopt indigenous belief systems. We also need to start believing in this, not at all. But it's about having humility and respect for other ways of knowing. It's about remembering that knowledge is plural and that our way, the Western scientific way, is not the only way. So bridging worlds, everyone seems to be talking about bridging worlds these days. It seems to be the slogan for almost every psychedelic not-for-profit that I seem to come across at the moment. But what does it actually mean to bridge these worlds between Western science and indigenous knowledge? Well, it requires us to be vulnerable and it requires us to be accountable. We need to understand that we're going to step into spaces where we might not know the rules, where we might get it wrong, and that's going to make us uncomfortable. It's going to make us feel like we're going to make mistakes. But what matters is really how we stay in relationship with these communities, how we stay in relationship with these indigenous peoples. And what I've learned over the last 10 years of working with the Shipibo is that indigenous traditions are ultimately about relationship, whether that's with ourselves, whether that's with spirit, whether that's with the communities that we're working with. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through some of the research that I've been doing over the last 10 years and how I've been trying to bridge those gaps and some of the shortcomings in that as well. So one of the first things that we did with ONAIA, my not-for-profit research organization, was to set up something called the Indigenous Advisory Board. And so these are various indigenous peoples who we work with, and they help us to co-create questions that we're asking in our research. They help us with the interpretation of the results, the data that we collect, and then also disseminating these results to the communities that we work with. That largely involves translating everything into Spanish, putting it to lay terms, and then getting it out there to the communities that we're working with. And so here we have Gemstone in the top left, who is an Indigenous Australian elder. Don Rono Lopez, who you met previously, who's a Shipibo curandero. His sister, Donna Angela Lopez, a Shipibo curandera. And Don Wilder Mawa, who's also a Shipibo curandero. And so a few years ago, we sat down with Don Rono and we said, okay, Rono, we've got some research that we want to do and we've got some funding. What exactly would you like to look at? And Rono immediately said, okay, I want to look at the relationship between humans and plants. And we immediately thought, okay, I mean, how on earth are we going to do this? How are we going to fit this into a Western concept? And so we sort of thought long and hard about it and thought maybe we could translate this loosely into nature relatedness. So this is a concept which looks at how connected people feel to nature, whether they feel at one with it, whether they feel nature is God, whether they feel separated from it. And we conducted a study looking at whether or not ayahuasca increases your levels of nature relatedness. And of course, because Rono helped us come up with the idea, he was one of the authors on that paper. And then following that, we said, okay, what would you like to look at next? And Rono told us that he wanted to look at the impact of different acaros, the medicinal healing songs that are sung in ceremonies, on different participants. And here we thought, okay, how do we look at that? These acaros, according to the Shipibo, are these spiritual technologies. They work in the energetic world. They work in the spirit world. This is a different paradigm. How on earth could you begin to look at this? So we thought long and hard, and we came up with the idea of using EEG hyperscanning, which is when you put various EEGs on different people at the same time. And so we ended up putting 5 EEGs on military veterans in the Amazon rainforest. We ended up time-stamping all of the changes in their brainwaves so that we knew when in the ceremony they had changes in different brainwaves. We then ended up recording Rono singing his acaros. I translated it into English, so we could see exactly when he was singing a healing acaro versus a protection acaro, and we time-stamped that, and then we thought we're going to compare them so we can see are his acaros influencing the brainwaves of participants in ceremonies. And so this is us when we thought we'd figured it out in the Amazon rainforest. And these are the military veterans who gave us their permission to look at their brainwaves in ceremonies. But actually, it wasn't as good as it seemed. So can we detect the impact of an acaro using EEG? Now, this is a really, really interesting question. So when I was speaking to Rono about this, I was describing the EEGs, and I was saying, yeah, we have these things like rugby caps, and we put them on each of our participants in the ceremonies, and we're going to look at the difference in brain waves because it picks up changes in electrical activity. And then Rono turned to me and said, well, you know what, Simon, that's all very well, but I've had caps on you, each of you, in ceremony over the last 10 years. Mine are in the spirit world, and I use it to check on everything that's going on with you, and mine are far superior to yours. And I was like, I mean, okay, man, you win this one. But it really got me thinking, are we actually looking at what Rono wanted to look at? He says, yeah, I want to look at acaros, and we say, okay, great, we're going to look at brainwaves. Again, this is still two different paradigms. What makes us think that our equipment could pick up on anything that Rono is talking about? So I would argue that even by doing this study, we might still be missing, despite our best efforts, what Rono is really interested in. Now, we actually didn't end up analyzing this data. And the reason for that is because we were concerned that although we got ethical permission to do it from the university, that would set a precedent that it was okay to bring that kind of technology into ceremonies. Obviously, our relationship with Rono is quite unique. We've known him for the last 10 years. He's part of Onaya. We do research together. But, there is a real power dynamic when people from the Western world bring money into the Amazon rainforest. And for the right price in Iquitos in Peru, you can do pretty much whatever you want. So I didn't want it to suddenly seem that it was okay to do this, that other researchers would suddenly do this as well. So we decided not to analyze that data. And I was also just thinking, is science really the right tool for this question? As scientists, do we know which questions to ask? Or would it be better to be designing the studies properly with Rono, and then maybe we'd be able to investigate these concepts better? Okay, so I next want to talk about interpreting results. So as part of my PhD, I was looking at the impact of ayahuasca on epigenetic change. Now, epigenetics is the way in which our environment changes the expression of our genes. And there are various studies that have suggested that maybe those changes could be passed down through generations. So very simply put, it's not quite as simple as this, but to have a basic understanding, different things can crank our genes up or crank our genes down. So for example, trauma. And in some early stage research, some other researchers have shown that the children of survivors of the Holocaust may be more prone to stress because they have certain genes related to stress that's been cranked up, and they're passed down through generations. And it seems in rat studies that those changes take about 13 generations before they naturally disappear. So one of our hypotheses was maybe one of the ways that ayahuasca works is by causing epigenetic change, and this is one of the underlying mechanisms of change. And so we conducted the first ever study to look at any psychedelic and epigenetics, and we found a signal that the sigma-1 gene, one particular gene, might have a change in the way it's being expressed as a result of drinking ayahuasca. And so I was really surprised by this. I was super excited by it. It was the first time anyone had shown this. And I excitedly told Rono, was like, hey, we found this thing. And I explained all about epigenetics. And he was like, yeah, I know. Like, we've known that for hundreds and thousands of years. We just call it cleaning ancestral lines. I've been doing it to you over the last 10 years. And I was like, right, okay. So I think, again, I was the only one in the whole jungle who was surprised by this result. And this got me thinking, is this just two different epistemologies that are actually looking at the same thing? Are we just using different languages to explain the same concept? Now, it doesn't always map on that easily. In fact, this is one of the only examples of when it actually does. But I think it's quite an interesting example anyway. So this is all great, and we've been trying our best to bridge this gap for the last decade. But we're still trying to fit Indigenous concepts into Western scientific methods. All of our results, all of our research is still framed within a Western epistemology. We're using Western methods, we're publishing in Western journals, and we're using Western metrics to look at each of these concepts. And so what I've been thinking about most recently is what might it take to change the way that we're actually conducting research. And so I want to spend the remainder of this talk thinking about decolonizing research and what that would actually look like. Okay, so when it comes to working with Indigenous communities, there are various things that you need to be very careful of and things you need to be aware of before you start doing that. So, for example, you need to make sure that you're following cultural protocols, that you are engaging with the respected ways of working with communities, with their knowledge systems and with their traditions. And it's extremely easy as well-meaning Western researchers to step into these other communities and to cause massive offense without meaning to. And in order to do this, we need to start thinking of research more as a conversation rather than imposing frameworks. And in order to do this, we need to be staying in dialogue with these communities and letting the process of research evolve as our relationships with them deepen. Obviously, we have to have protocols. In order to do research, we have to have protocols in existence, but there is room for flexibility within those protocols. And one of the best ways that I've found to do that is something called participatory action research. And that involves the community as co-researchers in the research process. And at the end of each research cycle, you sit down together, you think about what worked, what didn't work, and then you adapt the protocol as a result, and then you go into the next cycle. And that's how you conduct research. Now, when we think about Indigenous knowledge as a science, there are various things that we need to be considering. Indigenous knowledge is largely holistic and it's relational. It doesn't split the mind and the body and the rest of the world. In fact, in many Indigenous communities, there isn't actually two different words for mind and body. They only use one word to describe both. I would also like to challenge us to step outside of Western universals. This is something called epistemic disobedience, which is where we stop trying to place everything within Western scientific frameworks and think about what it would look like to take concepts from Indigenous communities seriously. So to really have that disobedience towards our own epistemology. And that requires us to recognize sacred realities, according to Indigenous groups like the Shipibo, as actually being real rather than just being metaphorical. Now, it's super, super easy, and I was definitely fell prey of this when I first started working with ayahuasca. Rono was saying, yeah, there are spirits and entities, and they're like speaking to you, and this person needs exorcism because they have a demon stuck to them. And I was thinking, yeah, but he doesn't really mean that. Like, that's some kind of theology, that's some kind of metaphor for something else that we know is actually going on as Western scientists. But to be properly disobedient from an epistemological point of view, we need to be taking these concepts seriously, not just thinking of them as some kind of flowery poetic language. And then Tuk and Yang remind us that decolonization is always about power and land and the production of knowledge. This isn't just some kind of metaphor for inclusion and diversity. And I'm really glad to see that many conferences now have Indigenous peoples on panels, there are Indigenous peoples on advisory boards. But if the power still remains with the Western scientists, that's not decolonization, that's just some kind of diversity. And we need to make that distinction. It's always where the power is. Okay, so here are some of my core principles for working with Indigenous communities. Ideally, we need to be letting Indigenous worldviews actually shape the questions that we're asking. And that allows the research to actually reflect Indigenous priorities and not just academic genders. It's not just about where the funding goes. It's not just about trying to kind of make your name in a field or whatever it is. It's about what actually benefits the communities. So an example of letting Indigenous worldviews actually shape the question would be with ayahuasca and depression. And again, this is just an idea that I've come up with. Obviously, it would need to be done with Indigenous communities. But how about if the questions that we were asking weren't what is the impact that ayahuasca has on depression, looking at symptoms like anhedonia, lack of energy, lack of libido, low mood, all those kind of things. But instead, if it was how does ayahuasca impact people's connection to land? How does it impact their perception of connection to ancestry and to spirit? Then those are different ways that we can reframe our research questions. The research that we engage with must be giving back. So the findings must be given in accessible ways so that other people can benefit from those results. Ideally, it needs to be supporting the goals of the community, ideally creating educational and economic opportunities, and hopefully strengthening the cultural practices of the community. And that way, science and research is an offering that we can provide to these communities. We need to be clear about our own position of power, and that requires us to need to be honest about how our power is going to affect dynamics that shape research. So if we are coming from a Western scientific background and we have all of the funding, we need to really reflect on how that's going to influence the research questions and how we interpret the results. We need to remember that consent that Indigenous people give to do research is an ongoing living relationship. Just because we've got ethical approval from the academy, from a university, doesn't then mean that we can just do whatever we want. That's one side of the ethical approval from the Western side. But actually, it's an evolving dialogue, and we need to keep that dialogue moving the whole time we're conducting research. We also need to protect what's sacred. So there are some things, according to Indigenous peoples, that you just shouldn't research, that just shouldn't be exposed to the wider world. And so we really need to listen to community guidance about what we can and can't include within our research. So how can we actually work together? Well, I would suggest that we need community boards that have real power. So this puts the community as a co-leader and give them actual power and authority over the research direction, methodologies we're using, and also outcomes. And decisions can be made surrounding the research from that collective dialogue. How about using stories as knowledge rather than just relying on quantitative and qualitative data? Now, there's a really beautiful example of this with the Maori from New Zealand. And they have this story about a water monster, and the water monster, which is a river, is flicking its tail, and the tail flicks violently over years. Now, various Earth system scientists in New Zealand realize that actually it's not just a story, that's actually describing the movements of a river and the way that the estuaries change, which was flooding a nearby community. And these Earth system scientists linked up with the Maori, and together they devised a research program that allowed them to evacuate these communities on time before they got flooded. So there are these ways that stories can be used, that Indigenous knowledge can be used in a scientific way as well. Now, visual representations as data. Quantitative and qualitative data can only get us so far. There are things like kuna and various other designs in Indigenous communities all around the world that present information in a different way that we can't get across just through words and just through numbers. So working with people who can actually understand that data, that can help us to understand it, is also extremely important. Another way that we could do this is using Indigenous categories for analysis. So for example, in things like qualitative research, when we have coding frames, rather than creating a coding frame that just exists from a Western scientific background, the coding frame could be designed and based around Indigenous concepts. So for example, instead of describing things as euphoria or depression, it could be jami niwe, which is a concept from Shipibo of removing a degree of negative energy. And that way, no matter who's doing the analysis, it's based around Indigenous concepts rather than framing everything through a Western scientific lens. And of course, where possible, sharing skills. So if we can share tools, methods, and resources to the communities that we work with, then hopefully we can empower them to lead the research in a way that they would like to as well. But there are definitely various risks and responsibilities that we have as Western scientists engaging with Indigenous communities to do research. One of the big risks is token inclusion without shifting of power. Diversity talk without structural change. Again, Tuk and Yang remind us that whoever holds the power is the one who has the power to decide which framework is valid. So we need to make sure that Indigenous peoples actually have the power, and it's not just in the hands of Western scientists. And Tuk and Yang go on to remind us of these moves to innocence that we need to be aware of. And they describe this as these small gestures that make us feel really progressive, but they actually leave these systems untouched. So for example, citing Indigenous ideas, but without actually giving land, power, or control back to Indigenous peoples. So, as we finish off, I want to start thinking about this wider movement that's beginning to happen within psychedelic science. Now, various people are beginning to think not just about what these medicines like ayahuasca do, but how we engage with them, for example, in ethical ways, cultural ways, and also spiritually. Now, the man on this slide is Benki Piaku, who's one of the leaders of the Ashaninka tribe, who are one of the largest ayahuasca-using tribes in Brazil. I've had the pleasure of getting to know him and starting to work with him over the last few months with his organization, the Urenka Institute. And Benki, along with ICEAs, which are a not-for-profit involved in this area as well, have created something called the World Ayahuasca Forum. And Benki at the moment is trying to get all the work, well, at least most of them, the ayahuasca-using tribes throughout South America to unite in dialogue about how they're using ayahuasca and get all of them to unite with scientists to speak about research into ayahuasca and plant medicine to try and get a dialogue going between the two worlds. And I'm very honored to have been given a senior position in running that dialogue from the scientific perspective. So this is really a movement towards communication and bridging these two worlds. And Benki, he doesn't shy away from saying the reason he's doing that is because the Western world is destroying the planet and he needs to do everything he can to try and stop that. Benki really is an inspirational character. He's a political as well as a spiritual leader and an environmental activist. He's won various human rights awards, and he also works with the United Nations. And I would very much recommend, if you are interested in this, making your way to the World Ayahuasca Forum this September coming. It's really part of a larger movement, and then that conference is the peak of it. So what would I like to see in the future in terms of this research? Well, I'd like to see Indigenous-led research normalized, where Indigenous peoples can define their priorities, their methods, their outcomes, and the research is actually serving the collective well-being of these communities rather than just the Western world. I'd like to see research where Western and Indigenous knowledge are actually placed side by side, rather than Western knowledge being put in a dominant position with the ability to validate or not to validate Indigenous knowledge. And I feel that in that way, they can inform and strengthen each other rather than being seemingly opposing. I'd like to see a move from extraction to co-creation. Can we do research with the communities that use ayahuasca and not on them as subjects? And of course, from ownership to relationship, recognizing that every piece of data that we collect comes from a context of actual living people. And when we collect that data, we don't own it. We're just being given the responsibility to use it for that time being. So Tuk and Yang remind us that decolonization is not just a metaphor. It's always about the repatriation of land and of life. It's not symbolic, it's not purely academic, but we actually have to be evoking change if we're engaging in decolonization. I want to see a science that is asking new questions that we didn't know to ask. A science that's really learning and listening and evolving. And instead of imposing its frameworks on these communities, it's open to the mysteries of different paradigms. And who knows, if we do manage to do that, then maybe science will evolve in ways that we never thought was possible. Thanks very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Wow, thank you, Simon. Yesterday I wanted to be a druid, today I want to be a shaman. We'll take some questions here. Remember to speak right into the mic, please.
I was wondering where you stand on ayahuasca tourism. The fact that our very presence in these communities is changing them. And yeah, as Dennis McKenna might suggest, the most ethical way is to take them out of the communities into the Western world. I was wondering where you come with that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the first thing to say is whether you agree with ayahuasca tourism or not, it's happening. There's no way that you can stop that from happening. So I think that the question then becomes, how do you engage with ayahuasca ethically? That's the question that we need to be focused on. But it's interesting, that point that you make about the Western world changing these traditions, because they're changing them in these really bizarre and interesting ways. So an example of that is this concept of brujeria, of witchcraft, of warfare. So ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest, about 50% of the time is about love and light, as the New Age movement would have us believe is all the time. But then the other 50% of the time, it's about love magic, where you literally like put spells on people to get them to have sex with you. Like, it's about warfare, it's about witchcraft. This is 50% of the work of curanderos, and people just don't talk about that within the ayahuasca movement. Now, as I just said, that doesn't fit with the Western perception of what ayahuasca is. And due to the market pressures of all the Westerners coming over looking for love and light, in the Amazon rainforest, the new generation of curanderos are beginning to not engage in brujeria and witchcraft and love magic, and mainly just train in all the, well, quote-unquote positive things. So there are all of these kind of changes that are happening. Some people argue that's a good thing. Some people argue that's a bad thing. But I think we need to be aware of it. And then there are various things that we can do if we are going to drink ayahuasca. things we spoke about in this talk, for example. So getting to know the community that you're working with, trying to engage in a degree of reciprocity, really deciding who you drink with, making sure that who you drink with are ethical, that they have their own reciprocal programs as well. There's lots of stuff that can be done. I think it's a fine line between cultural appreciation and appropriation.
Thank you.
I'm curious about your thoughts on working with plants, ayahuasca, but also plants that are not psychoactive. You know, naturally, when you're dieting a plant in the jungle, most of them are not necessarily psychoactive, but you're working with them as teachers. And what are your thoughts on working with plants that are from the country that you're from, as opposed to countries that, you know, us as Westerners are traveling to where we don't have ancestry or lineage?
Yeah, I'm all for it. I think that's an ideal situation. I think there are definitely risks with doing that as well, though. And so I know numerous people who have started dieting plants that are native to the British Isles, and it's really messed with them, because these are things that, you know, it takes 10, 20, even a lifetime, you know, of years to become an expert in. And I think it's all very well saying, yeah, we should be dieting oak, but to diet oak, you know, that's a huge undertaking. You really need to know what you're doing. And so I think that is beginning to happen. There are some people who know how to do that. You know, those cultures are beginning to be revived, which is excellent. But I think that you also need to be cautious when doing that. I personally have never dieted plants that are native to the British Isles, because my teachers don't know how to do that, you know, and I trust them.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I was interested in the response to the question before last, that you were hinting at some of the kind of complexities of indigenous cultures, because there is a kind of tendency, isn't there, in the psychedelic community to fetishize indigenous cultures and indigeneity, which is problematic as well. And I wanted to ask you about the political complexity of working with veterans in this context, because you could say, couldn't you, that sociologically, the kind of veterans who are really injured and need this kind of healing come from socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, and they enter service, and they may well be patriots, but they also enter service because they don't have other opportunities. And so in one way, you can see how the Western psychiatric model, seeing their trauma, seeing their kind of injury in terms of traumatization, doesn't address the political, social, and economic injustice they have suffered in their life history. But you can also see, can't you, how the indigenous model doesn't either, because you're looking at kind of models of connectedness and within a community, and you know, you can then return them to their communities healed, but the kind of original injustice is not addressed.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is the same issue that we see in the NHS, for example. So I used to work in addictions, and we would see people get admitted to the wards, and you get them off heroin or whatever it is that they're addicted to, and then if you discharge them back to the crack den, I mean, what do you think is going to happen? You know, they come back a few months later. And we see that a lot with the military veterans as well. They go through this experience where most of them, fortunately, feel significantly better after they've drunk ayahuasca. I think a lot of that is due to the fact that they're in the community as well, the community of veterans in the Amazon rainforest. But when they go back home, quite often, they go back into a really difficult situation, a really difficult circumstance, and then their symptoms begin to come back again, and they begin to fall back into old habits. So yeah, it's a massive issue, but it's a systemic issue. It's a systemic issue which is really, really difficult to treat. We're doing our best to set up support groups as well, but it feels like a drop in the ocean sometimes. But yeah, I completely agree with you.
Hi, Simon. Thank you. You really briefly said something about some things you believe shouldn't be studied by science and kept as sacred. I'm curious to know what those things are.
I can't tell you. Yeah, I mean, when you enter the world of diets, it gets very, very deep, very, very quickly. And there are some things that you don't even share with other people other than your maestro. And so obviously to publish that in a paper would be completely inappropriate. Things along those lines. But all Indigenous communities have that, right? There are things that they just don't talk about.
Thanks.
It's not really a question, it's more of a comment. I was lucky enough to share an office with a Maori Komatwa, an elder when I was working in New Zealand called Koromeki. And I was just hearing what you were saying about symptoms being an indication of broken relationship. And this was an inpatient psychiatric unit, and his perspective on patients coming in, in acute distress with, psychosis and mania and so on, that was coming from broken relationship and ancestral lines. And his method was bringing the family or the community together and trying to, I suppose, support people in forgiving each other, and in a kind of current context, but also in an ancestral sense, to try and heal their current distress. And it's just interesting, the kind of connections between the different Indigenous communities on other sides of the world.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed a lot your talk, and I was just reflecting on a question that you were saying, that our research has to give back to the communities, and I was just wondering, how can our research, how can that be useful to the Indigenous communities? Or, yeah, I don't know if I can comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different ways. And so another really nice example is some Inuits linked together with researchers in northern Canada, and then they together mapped the spread of hepatitis B, and that was like one way that it was serving the communities. Another way would be by training people who work in the community as well, so that they can do the research themselves. If there are particular things that they want to look at, that they're particularly interested in, if there are things that are affecting their communities, then that would be good. It's largely being led by what they want to look at rather than what we want to look at.
Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. That was very inspiring, interesting. I guess the thing that struck me is the level of spirituality and how important that is, where you've traveled and taken these medicines, and how that it's like an integral part of the therapy. And I'm involved in clinical research here, where that is very much not a part of the treatment plan, and but I can see the gap that exists there, and we're trying to transplant these old Indigenous models into this new Western, or this old creaky Western system that doesn't actually accommodate spirituality at all. And I think we're missing a trick there. And I guess I wonder, for someone who's obviously thought about this at length, have you thought about how spirituality might find its way into the clinical model that's emerging in the West?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the first thing to say about that is that, yeah, it's really difficult. These are two different paradigms and two different worlds, and they both think each other are ridiculous, which is unfortunate. So, for example, when I first started going to the Amazon rainforest and researching ayahuasca, I was based at King's College London, and some of the conversations I was having with people at King's College London were, wait, so they give ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest? And they're like, well, where's the hospital? It's like, it's like a day away by boat. And they're like, okay, well, what if something goes wrong? What if there's an emergency? It's like, well, they just kind of, use different plants in that case. And the psychiatrists were like, oh my God, that is so dangerous. I can't believe how dangerous that is. It's like, yeah, well, maybe it is. And then I would go back to the Amazon rainforest, and I say, yeah, we're doing these studies, and we give people psychedelics in a hospital-based setting. And Rono would say, oh, that's great. Yeah, that's great. Like, who's the curandero? Who's there, like, during those studies? It's like, you don't really have one. It's like, well, who, like, if someone needs, like, an exorcism, who does that? And it's like, we don't really use those words. We just kind of have a psychiatrist, and he was like, oh my God, that's so dangerous. And I was like, you're both saying the exact same thing. Like, I wish you would just listen to each other. But yeah, it's tricky, but there are ways that you can begin to do it. So there are in Australia, in the most recent mapped training, they're beginning to train dyads that have one Indigenous Australian and then one psychologist and psychiatrist. The Indigenous person is still very limited into what they can do, but even just kind of having their presence is like a step forward, like in that dyad, and that's in like randomized controlled trials as well, which is awesome. And then you have various other organizations who, there's one called Roots to Thrive. They're quite similar to Onaya in my organization in their approach. And they're doing group ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And they work with people who are Indigenous to Canada. So they're based in Canada. And so they literally in their protocols say, we have energy healers, and they don't specify who they are or what they're doing. But in reality, they're like shamans who are doing some work within the settings to maintain the safety of the space. So it is beginning to happen, but these are kind of really the only two examples that I know, and they're baby steps. But yeah, it's really hard.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Simon. Another round of applause.